Welcome to another conversation with the Apostate Sisters. I'm Patti, and I make this podcast with my sister Nancy. We grew up in a doomsday cult called the Worldwide Church of God. We're also nerdy about history and culture, but critical of religion. So get ready to get mad or to nod your head in agreement as we start a new series. We are going to trace the life and influences of the founder of our cult, the revered and reviled Herbert W. Armstrong. This series comes about because Nancy had a realization. Herbert W. Armstrong was who our parents idolized. They seemingly hung on his every word. So what better way to understand our indoctrination than to understand our parents' indoctrination? And because Nancy likes to get the big picture on anything she's interested in, she went all the way with this one. She left no stone unturned, as they say, in her quest to figure out why we had this strange upbringing where demons were real and where we expected that we wouldn't grow up. To understand the specific ideologies that shaped us, she looks back to religious movements as early as the 1600s. This shit runs deep. But mostly we'll spend the time looking at Armstrong's life and the tools, methods, and messages he used to control people. Something that stood out to Nancy was how fear was incited and exploited in all of the content that Armstrong put out. She created a short introductory montage to help give you a sense of the manipulation that was used to keep our family and so many others trapped in spiritual and financial abuse. Follow along with our series as we expose the great con perpetrated by Herbert W. Armstrong. Like, comment, and subscribe. This conversation needs your voice. Here's that montage. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. H.P. Lovecraft.
Recently in the news, warnings of a nuclear winter. Now we're warned that a nuclear war would produce an earth-covering cloud, would cover the entire earth.
If you want to control someone, all you have to do is make them feel afraid. Paulo Coelho.
Anywhere from 1 to maybe 3 billion people would be destroyed by the nuclear weapons themselves, and the rest would starve to death because no food could be raised. The sun's rays would not reach the earth. There would be no sunshine, no food. There would be starvation. It used to be only a few years back, if anyone talked about the end of the world, he was called sort of a doomsday crackpot.
The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge. Stephen Hawking.
Now, if you want to know the state of the world and where we are now and what is immediately ahead and what is going to happen next, you have to get it from one source only. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations, and then shall the end come.
To conquer fear is the beginning of wisdom. Bertrand Russell.
Who was the enigmatic figure? That is Herbert W. Armstrong, a man who rapidly rose to prominence, amassing a substantial following and one of the most influential yet ultimately destructive religious empires. Who comprised his devoted followers? How did he secure audiences with world leaders and foreign dignitaries? What led to the rapid collapse of this bizarre legacy he forged? And who are the survivors left behind and those who are still imprisoned? We, the Apostate Sisters, are among the survivors and are still grappling with the enduring repercussions of Armstrongism. We extend an invitation to come explore with us in this inaugural installment the intricate history of Herbert W. Armstrong and the Worldwide Church of God. Well, greetings, heathens. Because you always go, well, greetings, friends. Well, greetings, heathens. Yes, works. I don't know. Well, we're covering this topic of Herbert W. Armstrong and the Worldwide Church of God. So we are going to use this timeline that I have been working on for a while. We're just going to kind of dissect Armstrong's life. Who was this motherfucker? I'm sorry, who was this man? Yeah. Yes. It's time to heal. It's time to expose. He may have been dead for a long time, but his very destructive legacy does live on. And so we are here to at least try to put a stop to it and create a safe space for people to come to and say, I am one of those survivors, or I am actually one of the ones still imprisoned and I want to escape and I want to heal.
When we started this, our thoughts about what we were doing were kind of smaller or something, and we're shifting. Like I can see that we're finding more focus about what we're actually up to here, right? Because I think
Right.
at first we just thought we've got all this shit in existence within us that we know got put there because of the cult, and we're trying to unpack it. So I think you and I deciding to share our story was part of that. But once we started sharing our story, we realized just how many people are still stuck, how many people are going to need help as those churches collapse. And I think it's really important that not only are we providing whatever kind of like awareness or safety net we can for those people coming out, but that we also are making the skeptic, atheist, non-believer community online aware of their existence. Just because I think we're going to discover that some of those specific ideologies are going to lend to particular struggles among the folks coming out and things that are going to need a lot more unpacking because the conditioning that went into them about those topics was like cause them to be fully in like survival mode, right? Flight or fight.
Right. Mhm.
Yeah. Like it was so damaging in certain areas that I think it is important that we're not only reaching out for them, but we're expanding, like I said, the awareness of Armstrongist ideologies and how it affected those people. So the broader atheist community and non-believing community can be ready to embrace them
Right.
and get them
Exactly.
help. Yeah.
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 Exactly. This isn't just some fluffy, like you said, rainbows out your asshole type shit. This is a doomsday cult. There were
Mhm.
images in Armstrong's actual books of things that were extremely scary to us as children. We just envisioned this world that was coming up very soon where a third of the population was going to be dead due to things like famine and disease, and we had to prepare ourselves for that as little children. This was very scary for us. um Not only that, there were all kinds of ideologies in this church that were so different from other churches, and I like the term you used there too, like churches that'll be collapsing. um while I like the idea of people getting out of this religion and into a little bit prettier one like evangelicalism, I
Mhm.
am still not okay with it. It is still a form of control. They may have fluffied it up and poured syrup over it, but it's really the same concept. They're getting the same ideals from the exact same book without asking the first question instead of what is the true church, but is the Bible true to begin with? That's where we need to start. And that
Right.
actually
That's
ties,
mhm.
yes. Hmm.
I was just gonna say that, yeah, that's the thing I've discovered, even among folks who are deconstructing their Armstrongist ideas, is that the presupposition of A, God's existence, and B, the, I wouldn't say inerrancy, but the authority maybe of the Bible or the truth of the Bible seems to
Right.
be like so deeply embedded.
Hmm.
Right. I mean, no wonder it is, because what do we say in everyday life, right? Like, well, no one treats that book like the Bible, or they talk about, oh, this is my gardening Bible, right? Like we use the word Bible to mean authoritative source,
Yeah.
right?
And
So
that's exactly what it is. Yes.
Right. So it's all embedded in our language, and it's time to kind of extract those things.
People had gods since the beginning of time. There's been different variations. It's just that Christianity was one that had the most powerful force to control. So
Hmm.
it was a slow process,
Well,
but
and Christianity was born at the time that technology was changing from scrolls to codices, which is like a book. And
Mhm.
so that technological advance really embedded the one thing they wanted to print as a codice um, into, how culture would be built after that. Because I really think that ancient peoples held that the written word had magical powers. I mean, and that's
Right.
kind of how Armstrong talked about it. He flat out said if you write things in pamphlets and you give those pamphlets away for free, people will believe it.
Mhm.
Oh, all right, dude. Now we know. And I don't think he's wrong.
No, he's not. And he knew exactly what he was doing. He was an advertising man who studied not only business and marketing, but the psychological aspect of it. He studied philosophy, psychology. He knew exactly what the fuck he was doing. Like, how did Armstrong do this? How did he create what he did? And how did he get so many people to believe that he was like God's modern day apostle, that people would become gods in the future, and that God was literally speaking through him? And people still believe that to this day. Despite his empire literally crashing to the ground with all kinds of scandals surrounding it, and the church itself coming up and saying he's been wrong about things and we have actually been in a cult. Like, they had to swallow that pill, even though a lot of them still believed it. And so it took years for a lot of people to deconstruct from this before deconstruction was really a thing like it is today. Um, but Armstrong himself, I wanted to talk about his background a little bit. So, getting to the timeline here, one of the things that set Armstrong apart from other churches, first of all, he was not evangelical by any means. He grew up in a Quaker family, which I think is what, Protestant? Is that correct?
Or
Well,
depending on its lineage. Yeah. Like if it
yeah.
came out of anything beyond the Protestant Reformation, then yeah.
Mhm. Okay. It was Armstrong's goal to find the one true church, and somehow that came down to finding in the doctrine, which is the Bible, uh, keeping the Sabbath on Saturday, which is something that I think at the moment only Jews do, as well as a couple various churches out there. One of them is Seventh-day Baptist, one of them is Seventh-day Adventist, and another one that Armstrong had narrowed down in his research was a little church called the Church of God, which was very significant because this is the one that he got involved with, not the Seventh-day Adventists like some people think. Um, and so in my timeline, I wanted to go back to the very start of how this concept of Sabbath on Saturday started, like outside of Judaism, because obviously Armstrong believed in the New Testament and Jesus as the savior and such. Yeah, he was non-Trinitarian too, but that's a different topic. So the year goes back to all the way into 1650. Okay, that is when the Seventh-day Baptist Church was founded. As far as I can tell, this is one of the earliest churches, aside from Judaism, that discusses Sabbath on the seventh day, which is Saturday. Okay. And now this church, the Seventh-day Baptist Church, which is it's still in existence today. It originated in England in 1650, and it was formed out of this sort of like separatist or dissent movement out of England. So they didn't see any further hope of reforming what was the Church of England. Okay. This is sort of in its early years. Church of England is associated with um, King Henry VIII. He wasn't able to get an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because he wanted to be with his mistress. And so he broke apart from the Catholic Church, the papacy, and then he created his own church here, the Church of England.
Maybe we'll get to this in the timeline here,
Mhm.
but I can't help but notice the Age of Enlightenment in Europe
Mhm.
was around about the 1680s.
Yep.
And so to me, I see this like connection with, what you're saying, 1650. There was kings deciding, well, I'm just going to pay off the pope or break from the church or do whatever the heck I want to do. And I think that might have been the moment that the people were like, we
We're
can see
free.
you. Right. They're like, we can see you. And it was, I'm imagining this like mid to late 1600s, like deconstruction thing that was maybe happening, like it is again. And,
Mhm.
and to me, my brain is like, oh, that's why the Puritans were like, get me out of here. And why this
Mhm.
country got full of all these like religious extremists who were escaping religious persecution. No, 1650s, 80s, whatever, Europe was just woke as shit and they didn't like it.
Correct. For the times, yes. No, you bring up a good point. Okay, that was like 1680-ish. Yeah, that was after the Church of England came along. People started to change their tune. They started to think, well, the king can do whatever he wants. He can think whatever he wants. We're going to do our own thing. So either people left the church completely and started the Age of Enlightenment, or they wanted to go back to the strict old ways, like is very much the kind of people that would stick with Armstrong, even though um, his church split apart in the
Mhm.
90s. And so we have people like the Puritans and maybe Presbyterian groups or factions, offsets of these churches. They broke apart, and I'm sure they were all sticking together, but then eventually they started coming over to the US, and that's kind of how our US roots began, with puritanical viewpoints.
I agree. I mean, I think it is true that our founding fathers kind of had they were still slave owners and shit like that, but they
Yeah.
kind of had a slightly more enlightenment view. But I kind of think the general population, not so much.
And that makes sense, right? That's why I think it is so important to look at the history behind these sorts of things. We could go further back, but again, I just wanted to go as far back as this Seventh-day Baptist church began, because again, this was one of those Saturday on Sabbath which kicked off our old boy Herbert W. Armstrong. Okay. Yes. And then we jump
Uh,
ahead to the year 1831 with a term called Millerism, or the Millerite movement. Now, I had not heard of this until I had just researched it. Okay.
I mean, to some people, they might be like, what the heck are you talking about? 1600s, 1800s? Aren't we talking
Mhm.
about something that you guys grew up with? Yes, but isn't it like, I think this is the strength that you bring to the party, Nancy, is you can see this. Like, to me, this is the heart of deconstruction. Like,
Mhm.
you're saying, okay, let's pick this apart. Where did that fucked up idea come from? Oh, where did that goofy idea come from? Who put that stupid idea in there? Right? And
Right.
I just super love what you're doing of being able to stack up these things that you're seeing
Yeah.
that probably played into the influences that brought about what we dealt with.
Mhm.
Amazing. Amazing.
Well, exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons I was so sucky at things like being an employee, being a student, being a soldier in the US military. I wasn't good at just being told this is the way it is. This is a rule. You're going to follow this without asking any questions. Well, meanwhile, I didn't just ask questions. I wanted the whole fucking shebang about the history behind it. I'm like, why are we letting someone decide certain things in our life, but we don't know anything about them? Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but that's all right. So there was this clergyman named William Miller, which I'm assuming that was a very popular name back then, but um he had some
Might be a
religious
few of those
teachings.
around.
Yeah, a few though. Yes. William Miller of the Millers. All right. So have you heard of something known as the Great Disappointment?
Yeah, it's ringing a bell, but I
Mhm.
don't know either. What was the Great
But
Disappointment?
Well, anyway, this clergyman, William Miller, he apparently had these failed predictions of the second coming of Christ. Basically, exactly what Herbert W. Armstrong was doing when he predicted the return of Jesus in years like 1972, then 1975, and then other years. And then he just kind of brushed them off when Jesus didn't return. But then he said, well, Jesus will return in my lifetime. And then he died. And then the followers were still like, what's going on? Well, I mean, this is kind of the same concept with this dude back in
How about hashtag false prophet? Hashtag
yay,
false prophet.
hashtag false prophet. Exactly. There's been so many of them, but I just thought he was kind of relevant because he was teaching the exact same thing. I'm sure there were a lot of them out there, but then he became very famous because his prediction became known as the Great Disappointment because everyone thought Jesus was going to return. Yay, we're all saved. And then it didn't happen. So, 31. And then the Seventh day Adventists. Okay, we've been talking about them. Their church was founded, I want to say 1863, Battle Creek, Michigan. It's funny. I was just in Battle Creek last week.
Ugh.
Wow. Okay. So this was another, like, I guess you could say a separatist or splinter group. And this time it's from the Millerite movement. Okay. So that's how we got the Seventh-day Adventists. So this concept of Saturday Sabbath started with the Baptist Church, the Seventh-day Baptist Church, excuse me. And then the Millerite movement came about. And then by 1863, the Seventh-day Adventists had been created because these were people that had some problems with, of course, Millerism, but they wanted to take certain teachings with them. And so thus they created their own church. It's like a broken fucking record or watching the same boring movie over and over and over.
Mhm.
Yeah. And Armstrong said through his ancestry, he has a paternal great grandmother that traces back to Edward the First, King of England. The name Edward Longshanks ring a bell? You seen Braveheart?
No, no.
Braveheart?
Well, yeah,
No?
but I have seen it, but I don't remember that.
Oh, Edward the Longshanks. Yeah, that dude. Apparently, he's somehow related to, among other people. He
Interesting.
wa- Armstrong was always about being connected with men of great knowledge and power and all this. Like he wanted to be one of them. And I think he did what he could to be one of them. And he sure fucking did
Well, duh. I mean, the
in
dude
some
literally
form.
declared himself to be God's end time prophet and declared that all the people following him were literally God's elect that had transferred, like the elect status had been transferred to those white English speakers from the lost 10 tribes of Judaism. I mean, like, what the hell?
Like, yuck. Yuck. Okay.
Like, yuck.
Yuck. Getting back to his childhood, he was not religious growing up. And I would say into his early 20s, this entire time, he was just focusing on business and his advertising ventures and learning and studying, self-taught. He didn't go to college, but his parents did bring him to church, but it wasn't like what he ended up with. He attended something called First Friends Church in Des Moines, Iowa, which it looks like that is still around. So he regularly attended Sunday school. It was like a regular, I want to say, evangelical church in Iowa.
Well, it's
Maybe,
Quaker related, I'm gonna guess, if it had friends in the name, because even now, Quaker churches include that, the friend thing.
okay. That would make
Yeah,
sense. That
like
would make
part of their
sense.
shtick.
But it's like an evangelical mega church now. Okay. But
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
I don't think his parents were really like devout. It was just kind of the culture at the time. It's like people were Quakers and Armstrong, he was more interested in other things, believe it or not. He wanted to explore this world.
Well, see, if you look at like Victorian era, now granted again, it's
Mhm.
the like mirrored over to the US version, but there was like a lot of interest in seances and, you know, sort of esoteric, witchy-ish things, and like because photographs had become a thing that started, you know, you'd see like double exposure on photographs, which started a whole bunch
Mhm.
of like ghost kind of stuff, right? That went right along with the
Mm.
seance stuff. So I think there was this like big body of interest in kind of the occulty things. And then that caused by the time you get to the 1930s, at least in the US, I think there was like this big era of tent revivals and shit like that, that to me seems like a little bit of a backlash to the openness people had to the occult at that time.
Yeah.
That's just
Okay.
how
That
I'm
makes
analyzing it. But so I mean that's the ripe the ripe fruit that that Armstrong walks into with his knowledge of psychology and advertising tools, you know. So here there's like this revival happening of Jesus-y stuff, and he's gonna jump right in there and be like, well, yes, all of you, you are aware, and I'm the one with the truth.
yes.
Yeah.
Is
Like
that your final answer, Doctor?
have you heard of Azusa? I think that's what it was called. Azusa, California, maybe. It was this
Azusa?
like a tent revival thing where people in like the charismatic world
Mm-hmm.
uh
Like Jesus
will
people?
like Jesus-ish people,
Mm-hmm.
not the Jesus people, but
Okay.
so this was in like the 1930s, I believe, and it was like that whole tent revival thing where
Oh.
like the Holy Spirit's falling and people are like speaking in tongues and falling over and all that shit
Oh,
started happening
fringe.
where where that wasn't my understanding was it wasn't as much a part of it. But yeah, so anyway, people in the charismatic world kind of point to that Azusa thing as having been like when the Holy Spirit came to like finish the work or whatever.
Interesting.
So yeah, the fields were fertile for Armstrong to plow his whatever he used to plow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. That's good. That's good that you know what's going on in the times too. And I think that is important to talk about. Well, what was the culture like when these things were going on? You know, how did he
Hmm.
do people so bad? So yeah,
Oh, and
no,
I
that's
should
very
put a
important.
blanket statement out there that I am not like well trained or I don't have degrees or anything like that. I've just been curious and been trying to like assemble these things in my head for how the world
Hmm.
all fits together. So check
Yeah.
check my facts, check my facts. But
It's fine. We both have degrees, but it's like neither one are pertaining to this. This is all completely separate from
right.
our careers. But yeah, well, you raise a good point. You know psychology. We both know little bits of history, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Again,
very
no
good.
degree, just an interest.
No, it's good, Fast. Thanks for sharing. It's really good. All right. So we get to 1899. I wanted to, yes, talk about the church that Armstrong found. Now, he hasn't discovered yet. This is 1899. So, what literally a year after Armstrong was born is when the Church of God, and in parentheses, Seventh Day, was founded. Okay. It was a little church in Stanberry, Missouri. And get this, it was created from former Seventh Day Adventist members.
Of
So we
course.
have, of course, there's all these splinter churches. Is that what we're calling them? Splinter churches. All right. So there were
I guess.
doctrinal issues, people arguing over things that the Bible says. Oh my gosh. Seriously. So yeah, former Seventh-day Adventist who did not believe in the teachings of its co-founder Ellen White and was one of three Sabbath-keeping churches at the time, and by far it was the smallest and least well known. Even today, it's a really small church, but because of the name and the fact that it was so small was what was appealing to Armstrong. But again, that's getting ahead of ourselves. This is when the church was founded, okay? And it stayed relatively small. All right. It was in Missouri, and then there was some sort of Oregon conference part of it. And you know who moved to Oregon at some point. Yeah.
Me?
And Armstrong.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yes. In fact, a lot of this shit that takes place in the early beginnings of the church are not too far from where you live in Portland. So, yeah,
Hmm.
you're welcome. We could take a little day trip sometime.
And reach into my witchy life and go over there and smudge or Smoke cleanse the shit out of all that.
You're not going to prayer walk the whole area paths
Oh
and
yeah, I am.
Jesus will do the rest?
Oh no. No, I'll
Your
call a
version of
meet.
prayer walk.
Exactly.
Sorry, I need bourbon for this episode. Mm.
I'll just walk it with a blunt. That'll be fine.
Oh, yes. All right. So we come to summer of 1910. Also in Des Moines. Armstrong was about age 18 by this point. So I don't know if back then that was kind of like, hey, you're a legal adult now. Get out of the house, go do your own thing, whatever. But um he started working for the Daily Capital newspaper. Now, this was his early starts in advertising. He learned how to create want ads. Okay, so there was all these ladies that needed to rent out apartments at the time. And instead of doing these boring little ads like, oh, it's 2 bedroom, it's brick, it's got this, it's got that, he quickly learned, or he claims, how to sell that product, how to beautify this little apartment to say, this is something you really want. Let me show you this place. It is an incredible place to live. And then he fluffed it up. He fancied it. And so that he got all these people to be like, oh, okay, he sold so many a rental property, or like he so many rental properties um that the newspaper agency had sold because of apparently his work. And that is what kicked off his, I don't even want to say career. He had so many business failures, Pats. I mean, I think it was one of the reasons he felt like he had to use somebody else's work, like the Bible, to gain a following. But um, again, that's how he learned to advertise. And he just taught himself for his future ministry and his style of communication that he would ultimately use for his success, so to speak, his control. So that's where it started. His uncle had convinced him to take this job, and he took all kinds of trips around the US with different places. Again, he had so many business venture failures. He even sold pianos out of Danville, Illinois at one point. I mean, he got off track so often, but he was always teaching himself and he picked up on everything he did. All right. So then we come to 1917. The US enters World War I. Around this time, or like a month later or so, a couple months, is when he married a woman named Loma Isabel Dillon. And I should stress that that is his first wife because he did get married again later on, but we'll discuss that later and all that scandal. But his wife for most of his life, of almost 50 years, was Loma Dillon. And I firmly believe that Armstrong got into religion the way that he did because of his wife, who was his third cousin, by the way. I just wanted to throw that fun little nugget out. I think that was acceptable for the time, but again, yeah, it was a distant cousin affair.
That is still acceptable now.
And it,
I
what, in
know.
Alabama? Is it legal still?
Well, third cousin, second cousin is. It's because the only thing, it's not, I mean, we all think of it as an ick factor, but the reason for it is the genetics. And second cousin is far enough away that it doesn't cause, inbred problems.
And I think at least until what, the late 19th century in the US, marrying your first cousin was even acceptable, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't know all the laws, but yeah, that hung on for a while till they were like, maybe we don't want to be breeding people with those issues. Hemophilia is one of the first ones, I think.
Okay, I don't know anything about that, but again, yeah. Yeah, that was the thing. So he married Loma, and I feel like Armstrong's family, they were pretty normal, what I would classify as relatively normal people. I mean, his father was never really that stable. They moved around a lot. He had a lot of different jobs. But again, Armstrong was just focused on business and learning and all that. Despite so many failures along the way, he still learned. And he got into the Bible, I think, solely because of Loma. She came from a very strict Christian family. I don't know if they were Quakers as well, but they did not want Armstrong to marry Loma because he was affiliated with people who were known like agnostics and atheists and at the time, and he just
Oh
had no I
no,
know.
not atheists. Those people are
Scandal.
evil and they eat babies.
I know. So tasty. God, we do all kinds of horrible shit. Like control other people. Anyway, yeah, he was determined to marry her, and somehow he ended up. It was kind of fast tracked because World War II had just started like a couple months earlier, and I want to say Armstrong was actually drafted to the war, but then he ended up getting married, and I think if you were married and you have like a baby on the way, which they did at the time, he didn't get sent over, so something like that
Oh,
happened. But
okay.
I think his wife Loma Dillon had some very manipulative, just disgusting parents who I remember one part of his autobiography, if this is to be believed, that there was a man at their general store that his future wife Loma was a little girl, her mom was there, and this man just kind of pat her on the head and like, "Oh, you are a pretty young one, aren't you?" And the girl's mother just looked at this man like, don't tell her that. It's not good for her. So basically, taking away, stealing that compliment for this little girl. And then apparently she ran to the nearby mirror and looked at herself. She's like, but I am pretty, aren't I? And so I think Loma had very low self-esteem. She was very naive. And I know Armstrong had expressed concerns with that about bringing her to Chicago where he lived at the time, and she wasn't used to the real world, and she freaked out when she heard ladies talking about quote unquote evil and dirty things, and she freaked out and would call him at work and things like that. So um yeah, there was a lot of influence there. Obviously he loved her and wanted to make her happy, but eventually she convinced him of, religious teachings. But um about a month after they had gotten married, they were still living in Chicago. There was this well-known, highly publicized dream of Loma's, something about Jesus and angels, and you know how that works. Someone that's religious, depending on what religion you're in, you can sometimes see images in your everyday things. You can have dreams that you think make sense or is some sort of vision of the future or prophecy. Well, she told her husband about it. She told Herbert this, and he was not convinced. He was actually kind of embarrassed about it. He's like, okay, well, whatever. But later on, I want to say a few years later, he did become convinced that this was some sort of message for God that he was supposed to take and roll with. Again, this is after all of his failings in business ventures and such, and he wasn't getting anywhere. Well, if he were to just take the Bible and then all of a sudden he's got these people following him, I mean, like, oh yeah, maybe that was a message directly for me. Makes me feel special, makes me feel important. But
Makes
yeah,
me
we'll get there.
feel
So
elect.
elevated. Yes. See where I'm going with this? Yeah. So over the next few years, Armstrong and his wife Loma have a couple babies, both girls. We have Beverly Lucille and Dorothy Jane. And then the family ends up moving to Eugene, Oregon in 1924. And this, of course, was following several business setbacks. Things were just not working out for Armstrong, despite all of what he taught himself about business. But his parents did live in Salem at the time, which I don't know how close that is to Eugene, but that, yeah, they
They're
moved
about an
to,
hour away from each other.
there you go. Okay. They want to be closer to his family. So I don't know how his parents got out there, but again, his father moved around a lot. So
Hmm.
within the next couple years, obviously they're making friends, they're meeting new people in Oregon. Armstrong's wife, Loma, being the very religious woman that she is, she becomes affiliated with some lay leaders of the Church of God, this little organization that I was talking about earlier from Stanbury, Missouri. Their names were Ora and Emma Runecorn. All right. And then Loma, she's, when you get affiliated with certain people, sometimes they can have an effect on you, especially when you are completely vulnerable to hearing that message, which Loma was. And so she became convinced of this whole concept of, Sabbath on Saturday. All right, she was just completely invested in it. And she told Armstrong about it. I think it took him a while to be convinced as well. But eventually he thought, oh, well, that means this is the true church. Okay. And so he got affiliated with these people, the Church of God. Again, the name appealed to him and the whole doctrine of, well, this must be the true church because it talks about Saturday on the seventh day, blah, 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 which I don't even think the Gregorian calendar was in existence at the time. Well, this concept even started, right? Am I wrong about that? I don't know.
I'm
Julius
not
Caesar
sure.
even had a fucking calendar. Okay. But anyway, I'm not going to go way too far back. But okay, let's just say Armstrong was convinced of it, and he went on what he described as a 3.5 year crazed obsession of researching true doctrine of the Bible. As I mentioned before, he should have started with, is the Bible true to begin with? But no, he jumped straight to the Bible in and of itself, and he wanted to find the true church. So that was his starting point. And he did a lot of his studying at the Multnomah Library in Portland. You're welcome. I know you go there often.
So
It's a
weird.
great library.
It's so
Isn't
strange.
that weird that, like, yeah, he was there for so many years and that's like kicked off this church that we ultimately were raised in, and now you live so close to it.
I moved back to
Anyway,
the area. Weird.
yeah, I know. So he was even baptized in the summer of 1927 at the Hinson Memorial Baptist Church of Portland, Oregon. I don't think that's affiliated with his organization in any way, and I think the reverend who baptized him was a non-Sabbatarian pastor, but whatever. That's where it took place. All right. So around this time when he was doing all this studying, um, he also became like a preacher or a pastor for this church, and he actually gave sermons. So after he was baptized, over the next several years, he started putting out some writings. He used to write for the Bible Advocate. He had his third child, which was also his firstborn son, named Richard. We don't hear about him much because he died at a relatively early age, but we'll discuss that later. Yeah, he put out several writings. It got to be around the time of the Great Depression when he was still living in Oregon. And then he ended up having his fourth child, Garner Ted Armstrong, who would go on to follow him in the Worldwide Church of God amidst later scandal. He also did
Mm.
things like he was an ordained minister with this Church of God. He would do these 15-minute morning devotionals with KORE. And so he was making a name for himself.
Oh, so he got on the radio. So he was trying it out on the radio,
Right.
but with this
Mhm.
other church.
Right. It started with
Okay.
this other church, but you know how these things go. We already discussed how people break off from churches. Armstrong did the exact same thing, and that's how we get to the point where he created his own church. It was called the Radio Church of God initially in either 1933 or 34, depending on when he incorporated it. And he was preaching his message not only in this free literature that he was handing out to people, but also on the radio. People were listening to his voice. And these were the early beginnings of how his actual church got started.
Wow. I've had to really
Okay.
think about this with how he did all the publications because his whole thing was
Mhm.
making pamphlets, booklets, books, and then giving them away for free. Like that was
Right.
his whole thing. And maybe I know I've said this, but he literally declared that if you write things and give it away for free in little booklets, people will believe it. And
And
so he figured out that it didn't matter. He wasn't trying to get money for the books and booklets.
mhm.
He
Right.
realized if he could hook them with these free things,
Yeah.
that then he could condition them into his church and get up to 30% of their income.
Mhm. But this was
I
also
mean,
when the Great Depression was going on. And so people would hold on
Man.
to whatever thing that was free that they could. It might be something of value at some point. So he knew that. He was an advertising man who taught himself all of this, I want to say, forms of manipulation, how to sell, whether it's a product or an idea.
It seems not correct to think that here he started the notion of using marketing ideas to sell ideas instead of products. I'm sure he wasn't the first, only, earliest,
Oh,
best
no.
at all,
No.
but that's exactly what he did.
Right.
He was able to take all of this, like they didn't call it probably psychology at the time, but all of the psychological understandings that we were building for
Mm-hmm.
how to get people to buy things, because the world of products was like opening up, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
so he just applied those and was like, and he totally used the fact that he gave away this free thing to make people think, well, it made people trust him. Right? I
Mm-hmm.
think giving these things away for free, people are like, well, he's giving these away for free. He must really care. Like, he's not trying to take anything from us or dupe us or sell us something. He's giving to us.
Right.
And then people are sunk
Mm-hmm.
because they trust him already from that.
Yes. And he knew exactly what he was doing.
And so that's going to boost their trust in what he says in those booklets, too.
Yeah. Whether he was actually convinced of this material or not is up for debate. But either way,
Good
he took the
question.
information and he rolled with it, and he knew exactly what to do with it to gain masses and start building.
Yeah.
And he lived a lavish life. Again, getting ahead, we'll talk about that, but he lived very, very well off.
I mean, to defend him in the tiniest bit, he lived well off in a time when that was thought of as like that proved God's favor on you, or
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? Like there was so many conditions in place socially that that's what was supposed to happen, right? Like that was, I don't know what I'm saying. How am I saying this? Okay. But the society at large wasn't telling him that what he was doing was gross. They were encouraging it because he was a
Yeah.
successful businessman that loved the Lord, and that looked like everything that people wanted to have happening in our culture at the time.
It was like he was a chosen favorite of God.
Oh, yeah,
Ah!
just like it.
Yes.
It's obvious.
And all his followers are like the little chosen minions. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this part one of the history of Herbert W. Armstrong and the Worldwide Church of God. I hope you all got something out of it. Those of you that are survivors, please do reach out to us. We are available on YouTube, on Instagram, and on Spotify in audio format. Please like and subscribe. And we hope to see you soon for part two. All right. Bye.
Bye. Like and subscribe.